Hi everyone, welcome to Equals. This is Naf.
Hi everyone, this is Max. Oh, Naf, you do not sound well. You're full of cold.
Yes, I have a cold, but it sounds worse than it is. And I'm really excited about today's podcast. That's why I had to get off, my sick bed. Happy Davos Day, Max.
Yes, today is Davos Day. It's the launch of our Davos report, and billionaires have had an incredible year. We've seen billionaire fortunes rising 3 times faster than last year. And you can see, today we're seeing a billionaire president inaugurated. We're seeing so many billionaires in his cabinet. The power of billionaires in our economy is there for everyone to see. And our big argument this year is that billionaire wealth is not the result of hard work and talent, but most of it is taken and not earned. And in particular, we're going to focus down on the colonial history of wealth and the way that the modern economy in our world can still be called colonial in many ways, sucking money from people in the global south into the bank accounts of predominantly white men in the global north. So that's exciting.
Love the headlines, Max, especially on colonialism. And I'm happy today's podcast will also be focusing on this pertinent issue. And we have an incredible guest today, Jason Hickel, who's an academician, an activist, and an author of amazing books such as The Divide and Less is More. Jason is also a good friend of Oxfam's.
Yeah, it's really good of Jason to do this. And this is a really interesting interview. So let's get into it.
Let's listen to it.
So, Jason, welcome back to Equals. It's fantastic to have you back. Why, for you, does inequality matter? Why should we care about 5 trillionaires instead of 1 trillionaire? Why is it so important?
First, thank you so much for having me back on the show, Max. Good to be with you and with Naf. And congratulations on the forthcoming report. I think that it's really powerful, and I think that readers will really find a lot in there. But in terms of inequality, this is an extremely bad situation. And I think that the key here is to understand that accumulating money is not like an abstract thing, right? It's not just about like abstract credits that people pile up in the bank. Money represents control over labor and investment and production, right? So when you have elite accumulation like this on this crazy kind of scale, it means that the rich overwhelmingly exercise control over our labor and our productive capacities, right? They're the ones who get to decide how our labor is mobilized, what we produce, and who benefits from it. And of course, for the capitalist class, we know that the objective of production and of growth, right, is not to meet human needs or to achieve social progress, okay, the things that we would want an economy to do. The objective for them is to facilitate their own consumption, right, which they do by getting us all to produce mansions and yachts and private jets for them and so on, right? Or to maximize their profits by investing in like highly profitable sectors, even if they happen to be very destructive, which we know is the case with like fossil fuels, SUVs, fast fashion, the military industrial complex. These are sectors of the economy that we don't actually need, but which are highly profitable, so we still produce them because they benefit our elites. I was just recently looking at data on this. Right now, the richest 5% control 70% of the world's wealth, which basically means that 5% of people on this planet determine 70% of global production, which is wild when you think about it. It's basically an authoritarian system, effectively, and none of us should accept it. But I also want to say that money is not just about command over labor. It also represents command over real resources and energy. So think about it this way. A person with $1 billion gets to consume about 100,000 times more real resources and energy from our planet than the average person in the world. So this should be abundantly clear to everyone that during an era of severe ecological breakdown, it makes zero sense to allow elites to consume such massive quantities of our planet and of our collective future. And then also, I think it's important to highlight that elite accumulation like this is totally incompatible with democracy, right? Like, we have to be very clear about this. These people massively corrupt the political process. They buy politicians. They swing elections in their favor. And of course, they massively corrupt also our media environments, like buying up newspapers and and media outlets, controlling the public discourse to ensure that it generally supports their interests, et cetera, et cetera. It's like, if you ask me, it's simply not possible to have a functioning democratic system under these conditions. And it's wild to me that countries like, say, the UK and the US call themselves democracies when you have a media environment that is overwhelmingly controlled by the rich and by corporations. It just doesn't make any sense. So these are, for me, these are the major concerns. But in this, in your report, you had this interesting stat about how billionaire wealth is taken, not earned, which I really liked. I liked that framing. But I think we could also go further and point out that all income and wealth held by the capitalist class results from production. And we know that production cannot occur without workers, right? Which is what all of us do. And so all income and wealth in our economy is actually produced by workers. And elite accumulation occurs only because the capitalist class is able to ensure that workers receive less than the total value they produce, right? With the surplus or the difference being accumulated by elites. And that's ultimately at the core of the problems.
Thanks so much, Jason. What you said actually nicely leads to this next question. So, our Davos paper this year, as you have seen, really zeroes in on colonialism, subject you have covered closely. So, who were the main beneficiaries of the age of empires and the annexation and colonization of so much of the world?
This is such an important history. I think it's important for people to understand that colonialism fundamentally shaped the world economy that we have today. In fact, capitalism has always been fundamentally colonial in nature, and this is evident from the very origins of capitalism in Europe in the 16th century. It was immediately a colonial project. There's no temporal distinction between the rise of capitalism and the rise of the European colonial projects. Now, remember that the main objective of production under capitalism is to maximize profit, right? So this requires depressing the costs of labor and resources as much as possible. And we saw that in the early centuries of capitalism, European capitalists brutally exploited their own working classes. But there's, of course, always a limit to how much you can do this domestically without facing a revolution, right? You're going to also need some kind of frontier, some kind of external area where you can even more brutally exploit the working classes with impunity, right? Not only the working classes, but also their resources and so on. And this is where the colonies came in. They brutally exploited the working classes of the global South, including through mass enslavements of tens of millions of people for several hundred years, right? And they appropriated vast quantities of resources from Asia, Africa, and Latin America virtually for free, dramatically enriching the European elites of the time. Now, the main objective of colonialism, and I think it's important that people grasp this, was to fundamentally reshape production, right? Economic production in the global South. The idea was to basically force people to shift from producing primarily for their own communities and their own national development, right? To instead produce in ways that would service consumption and accumulation in the imperial core. So, to use a very banal example, instead of producing grains and vegetables for your own community's consumption, you're made to produce, say, sugar or cotton for British traders. Okay. Now, this basic, the overall effect of this is basically to create underdevelopment and mass deprivation across most of the global South. Not because the South was not highly productive. The South was extremely productive, right? With massive resource endowments and massive labor endowments. They're rich countries, but their productive capacities were organized around servicing elite accumulation in the imperial core, again, primarily European elites, which left them in conditions of mass deprivation and also led to these extreme levels of global inequality between countries that had never existed before in history.
One thing I'm curious about is, and we've been grappling with in this paper, is that many of the incredibly unfair aspects of today's modern global economy we've covered before in Davos papers, whether it's, supply chains and corporate power, monopoly power, or, the taxation system and the injustice of that economic system. But we've never before tried to call that colonial. And I'm curious to know from you, Jason, what you think the added value in. I think everyone would agree that the historical colonial period was appalling and the crimes of that period have echoed into the present day. But where do you see the added value in going further and describing the economy of 2025 as inherently colonial, not just unjust?
Yeah, I think this is super important because it may not be readily evident to many people, right? But I think it helps to understand this in the context of history, right? There's actually a fundamental continuity between the colonial period proper and the period that we're currently in. So let me see if I can describe this, right? So basically, in the middle of the 20th century, we know that progressive and radical political movements across the global South, right, in Asia, Africa, Latin America, succeeded in overthrowing their colonial occupiers or otherwise elite stooges of the colonial powers. And as they did so, right, this is the 1950s and 1960s, their first objective was to begin rebuilding economic sovereignty in their own countries and organizing their productive capacities around meeting human needs and development objectives nationally, right? And also regionally. And they used policies like public finance to sort of publicly direct production towards social objectives. They used public services like healthcare and education, et cetera, et cetera. They used nationalization to regain control over their resources. They used subsidies and tariffs and capital controls to protect their key industries and build them up to be globally competitive. And these moves were incredibly successful. Like the empirical record is very clear that during this period of the 50s, 60s, and 70s, we saw incomes and consumption in the global South increasing really dramatically, social indicators improving faster than we had ever seen in the global South before during the colonial period, of course. So it was something of a development miracle, which is remarkably not well known in contemporary development circles, right? It's almost like, poverty and underdevelopment has always been this intractable problem. No, there was a period in the middle of the 20th century when it was, these problems were successfully, like countries were on a successful path to addressing them. But what's interesting is that this success caused very significant problems for the core states. Because remember, the core states relied on cheap labor and cheap nature from the periphery, from the global South. Economic sovereignty in the global South during this miracle period meant that now Southerners are producing and consuming for themselves. They're consuming their own resources. And what this meant is that Southern resources and labor were not so cheaply available for consumption in the core. And this made capital accumulation for the core states and core firms very difficult to achieve. It basically triggered a crisis in the late 1970s. So the core states basically faced a choice, right? Either they could accept decolonization in the global South, accept global justice, and transition to a post-capitalist economy that does not require perpetual elite accumulation, or they could somehow intervene to reimpose the imperial arrangement that they had enjoyed before. And they opted hardcore for the latter, right? And they did this in part by intervening militarily to forcibly remove progressive leaders in the global South, right? And we know there's a long history of Western-backed coups of progressive democratically elected governments in the global South. But they also did it by leveraging the World Bank and the IMF to impose structural adjustment programs across the region, right? Now, structural adjustment programs basically forcibly removed all of the progressive and socialist policies that global South governments had been using to such great effect. And they reorganized, right? They reorganized Southern economies into the position of being subordinate suppliers within global commodity chains that are dominated by big Western firms. That was the main intervention that structural adjustment achieved. And this is the world that we inhabit today. So today, basically all of the big Western corporations, right, like name them, Apple, Starbucks, Nestle, H&M, whatever, they rely very heavily on production that occurs in the global South at very cheap prices, but the profits are overwhelmingly accumulated in the global North.
So, Jason, I also would love for us to talk about, elite accumulation also from the global South, because I sometimes worry, that in breaking free from colonialism, of course, which is an evil system, we will simply substitute homegrown billionaires for foreign ones, another form of oppression or power imbalance. So, have things changed that much for the global South? We're already seeing this in different parts of Africa, from Nigeria to Angola, meaning billionaires doing what they want to do. So how do we stop that from happening?
Yes, of course. These global South elites have incredible power. And this is a problem, which I'll discuss shortly, but it's nothing like the kind of power that the core states and the core firms have. Like we just watch country after country get destroyed in the global south at the whim of Western leaders. But clearly, we also need to recognize, as you pointed out, that capitalist elites in the global south are a big part of the problem. They're basically what we call comprador elites, right? They're very happy to go along with the imperial arrangement so long as it benefits them materially, which it does very prodigiously in many cases. So I think that, like, in light of this, we have to be clear. The first objective of progressive political movements in the global south must be to overcome this national capitalist class, these comprador elites, who are the local expression of imperial power, overcome this class and ultimately reestablish real political sovereignty and economic democracy nationally, so that national productive capacities in the global south can once again be organized around meeting human needs and achieving development objectives.
So, Jason, I think earlier you were talking about the form of production. Who owns the form of production? Resources is. I want us to link that to the climate crisis. Actually, specifically to climate solution, because we spend a lot of time talking about the climate crisis and how that is creating, inequality and injustice. But my fear actually is even the climate solution is going to create more injustice and more inequality because there's the race for transition for minerals. So do you think this will perpetuate colonialism, and how can we break free from this cycle? How can we beat climate without making inequality worse?
This is super important. Yeah. So I think it's abundantly clear to me that existing proposals for green capitalism, which are emitted from global north elites, do in fact massively perpetuate colonial arrangements, and I think this is true in several respects. So first, let me say this: like, we know that the main obstacle, in fact, to achieving sufficiently rapid decarbonization is the very high levels of energy use in rich countries, right? Rich countries have extremely high levels of energy. Most of it is energy that is devoted to production of totally unnecessary sectors and elite accumulation, right? Like, it doesn't benefit humanity at all. It doesn't benefit the national population or the working classes. The only way that these countries can decarbonize fast enough to stay within their fair shares of the Paris Agreement objectives is if they reduce excess energy use, right? By around the region of 50%, which is pretty substantial. And of course, this is not on the table. This is not on the table for the existing ruling class. In fact, they are dead set on the opposite, on maintaining high levels of energy use. And then they want to find a way to reconcile this with the Paris Agreement objectives. And so they do this in several ways, right? One, and this is super important and must be underlined, they want to constrain energy use in the global south. They want to constrain energy use in the global south. In some cases, to levels so low that people cannot meet even basic human needs. This is deeply colonial. And to the extent that it deprives people of the means of life is effectively genocidal, right? So this is clearly not acceptable. A second thing that they do is they want to rely on negative emissions technologies, right? So the idea is that we can emit a lot now, overshoot the climate targets, and then pull emissions back out of the atmosphere later in the century through technologies like BECCS, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. And if you look at these proposals, they're actually crazy. Like, the basic idea here is to establish massive plantations in the global south where you're going to grow biofuels. This pulls carbon out of the atmosphere, and then you use the biofuels to provide power to the global north. We're talking about plantations 3 times the size of India, massive quantities of land, pulling land away from food production, pulling it away from forests, causing extensive ecological damage, because this is basically like monoculture, right? So you're basically diverting productive capacities in the global south to supply energy to over-consuming countries in the global north, and using this as your mechanism for solving climate change is just like breathtakingly unjust. And the same is true for like existing proposals for decarbonizing transport. The idea here is that we're just going to replace every combustion engine vehicle with an electric vehicle, And of course, electric vehicles are crucial, very important. But if you're going to do a one-to-one replacement like this, instead of using, say, public transit and active mobility, et cetera, it's going to require massive material extraction from the global south for all the batteries and all the materials for the new cars, et cetera, et cetera. So, I mean, the vast majority of this extraction is going to occur in the global south in most cases under extremely destructive conditions. And so you can see again how the benefits are accrued in the north and the damages are offshore to the south over and over again. I mean, and this is one of the things that I think degrowth scholarship has really focused on. Like, so many of these problems of these colonial dynamics can be solved by reducing excess energy and material use in the global north. We need to degrow damaging and unnecessary forms of production in the global north, like things that only contribute to like elite accumulation, which are actually unnecessary for good lives. And then what you do is you focus your productive capacities instead around what we know is necessary for human well-being and social progress, right? There's all this fascinating research that's been coming out over the past few years showing that it's possible to provide decent living standards for 8.5 billion people on this planet with only 30% of our current global energy and material use. 30%. And that includes, right, this includes providing universal access to healthcare, education, modern housing, electricity, sanitation, public transit, refrigerators and freezers, washing machines, heating and cooling systems, mobile phones and computers, et cetera, for the entire global population, permanently eliminating poverty and deprivation with 70% less energy and material than we currently use. And that is what we have to be fighting for.
I completely agree. I found those studies really heartening, actually, because I think deep down within many of us, we think it's just not possible ecologically for everyone to have a decent life. And to see that kind of, clearly shown to not be the case, I found actually quite heartwarming, and that the fight is more for a more equal world. But in terms of on this broad question of hope, I mean, I've got to be honest, I'm really struggling at the moment, Jason. It's a very dark times. Where do you see hope, if any, in 2025? What still makes you feel positive, and can you cheer me up?
I don't know if I can cheer you up, Max. I mean, I agree. We're not in a good situation, and I think that we have to be very clear-eyed about this. That it's going to require building a political movement that is strong enough to overcome the current ruling class, who have an interest in maintaining the status quo of the world economy with its full injustices and its violence and its deprivation and ecological crisis. And I think we have to be very clear-eyed about this. Right? Look, I think that if one thing has emerged as a fact in the past couple of years, it's that the existing liberal parties that we have in, say, until recently in the U.S. and in much of Europe, this like existing liberal establishment is simply not up to this task. They have proven themselves to be fundamentally incapable of addressing basic social and ecological crises, right? Like the climate crisis, is not difficult to resolve. It requires, sufficient public investments in things like renewable energy and public transit and insulating buildings and, regenerative food systems, et cetera, which are not profitable enough to the capitalist class. Like the current liberal parties are not willing to take these steps, because when it comes down to it, they're fundamentally aligned with the interests of the capitalist class. And if ever there's a tension between the interests of capitalism and the interests of workers in the environment, they will throw workers in the environment under the bus. And we have seen it over and over and over again, right? So I think the reality is that these parties have failed, and we're going to need new political formations, like real working class parties, grassroots power that can develop a mass base and ultimately win elections.
I'm not sure I'm cheered up, but I definitely agree.
Well, and look, I mean, look, in a way, it seems kind of impossible right now because, these movements don't really exist. But I think we have to take inspiration from movements in the past that have achieved this. There's this amazing saying that Thomas Sankara used to write. He was the revolutionary leader of Burkina Faso. He would always point out that we are the heirs of the world's revolutions, right? Like all of the good things that we enjoy right now were brought to us by revolutionary struggles of the past. And so if you look back to in British history, like the successes of the labor movements, which built the NHS, for example, which built the education system, built the sanitation systems and the housing systems, et cetera, or the successes of the feminist movement, um, which brought us like at least legal equality between women and men in most cases, et cetera, et cetera. These are, I mean, enormous achievements, like the success of the civil rights movement in the USA, the success of the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, the anti-colonial movement. I mean, is in some ways the most spectacular of them all. I mean, these are the most oppressed people on the planet, the poorest and most oppressed people on the planet, who overcame the most powerful imperial forces that world history had ever known. Like these successes can be achieved, but of course it takes organizing, it takes strategy, and I think that's the era that we have to enter now.
Oh, yeah, I completely agree. You only have to look at the obstacles that people faced in the past, and we've got no excuse.
Yeah, I totally agree. Let's face the reality, which is really not nice. It's bleak, but I love how Jason said it. Like, we need to organize. And I feel like we're repeating history, no? When it should not be repeated.
Jason, that was amazing. I knew it would be, and it was fantastic.
Sounds good. Thanks very much, Max. Thanks, Naf.
Thank you. Bye.
Wow, what a great interview. So, Naf, what does this make you think of?
So I have been thinking about this for a while, Max. I went to a friend's christening here in London, and I was talking to this man about work, and he started telling me that he has been giving money to charities across Africa for the past 40 years. And he was sad and perplexed that, things haven't changed. And I understand his confusion, and I actually find it painful because this issue is a lived reality, yeah? We should all be asking ourselves, why are we in the same situation? Why are rich countries and the richest rich and the poorest countries and people poor? There's a reason for it, and it's largely to colonialism and legacy of colonialism. This is not just about the past. And as our Davos report shows, huge amount of resources are still being exploited, extracted, and taken away from the south to the north up to now, even in this present time. Then how do we expect things to change?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think what I found, and for a start, I think it's really important for people to understand that for, you know, every dollar in aid going to the global south, we calculate at least $4 is being paid back through debt repayment, through the broken financial system. That the flow of wealth is from the poorest countries in the world to the richest. And I think that is something most people don't realize. But then what this report did for me was actually explain further and say the reason these are the poorest countries in the world in the first place is because that transfer of wealth can be traced back to the colonial period, that it's no accident that you have a rich world and a poor world and suddenly we've all got to give to charity and do something about it. That poor world was deliberately impoverished through empire, through colonialism, and that unequal system that we see today has a historical legacy. And I think that is really important to understand because it has a big impact on the solutions that we're looking for, to have that kind of perspective.
Exactly, Max. That's why I love this year's Davos report, because it contributes to an important debate. We want things to change, no? We want things to transform. Then we need to understand what the underlying issues are: inequality, colonialism. We also need to be clear what we are up against. And for this, as Jason said, we need to organize. And I would also add, we need to educate. That's the only way we can create a better world for all.
Yes, indeed. I agree. So thanks for listening, everyone. Please do have a look at the Davos report. It's called Takers, Not Makers. And it's really, really good. Lots and lots of people from across Oxfam worked on it, and it's got some really, really interesting stuff in it. And we'll see you next time on Equals.
Thanks, everyone. Until next time.
Thank you. Bye.